Two strangers, one deadly secret. When their paths cross, everything they thought they knew will be turned upside down. What happens when trust is broken and the truth becomes a weapon? Watch the story unfold in ways you never expected. Stay until the end and share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more thrilling stories. Lincoln James walked briskly along the dimly lit sidewalk, his hands tucked into the pockets of his jacket to shield them from the biting wind. The evening air was heavy with the scent of rain, and the quiet streets of his neighborhood seemed to stretch endlessly before him. It had been a long day at the community center, where Lincoln worked tirelessly to provide aid to struggling families and homeless individuals. He was exhausted, but content. Helping others gave him a sense of purpose he'd never found anywhere else. As he approached the parking lot of a large administrative building, Lincoln noticed something unusual. A man in a sharp business suit was standing near a black sedan, flanked by two police officers. Their conversation seemed tense, with the officers leaning uncomfortably close to the man. Lincoln paused, his curiosity piqued. The man gestured animatedly, his voice rising just enough for Lincoln to catch snippets of the argument. "You can't silence this," the man said, his voice firm. "The public deserves to know the truth." One of the officers stepped forward, his hand gripping the baton at his side. "You're in over your head," he said coldly. "Walk away now, or you won't walk at all." The man in the suit didn't back down. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket, and the officers reacted instantly. Within seconds, the situation escalated. One officer struck the man across the face, sending him sprawling onto the asphalt. The other officer joined in, kicking him viciously as he lay helpless on the ground. Lincoln froze, his heart pounding. His first instinct was to call for help, but he knew how these situations could unfold. The victim often ended up blamed, and witnesses were rarely safe. Instead, he pulled out his phone and began recording. His hands trembled as he captured the brutal scene, the sound of blows and the man's groans filling the air. "You think anyone will believe you?" one of the officers snarled, leaning down to the man's level. "We own this city." The man's response was barely audible, but Lincoln caught the words, "You'll regret this." The officers glanced around, their paranoia evident. Lincoln quickly ducked behind a nearby car, his heart racing as he stopped the recording and saved it to his cloud account. He knew he couldn't linger. If they saw him, he'd be their next target. Lincoln hurried away, his mind racing with what he'd just witnessed. He couldn't shake the feeling that the man in the suit had been targeted for a reason. What truth had he been trying to expose? And why had the officers been so desperate to silence him? Lincoln decided to wait until he was safely home before reviewing the footage. The next morning, Lincoln awoke to a flurry of news reports. The man from the parking lot had been identified as William Carter, an investigative journalist renowned for exposing corruption. His body had been found in a ditch just outside the city limits. The police claimed he'd been the victim of a robbery gone wrong, but Lincoln knew better. The memory of the officer's brutality was seared into his mind. Lincoln spent the day agonizing over what to do. The video he'd recorded was explosive evidence, but sharing it wasn't without risk. He thought about uploading it anonymously to social media, but hesitated. If the police traced it back to him, he'd be in danger. After hours of deliberation, he decided to send the video to a local news outlet known for its integrity. He composed a short email attaching the video and explaining what he'd witnessed. As his finger hovered over the send button, a nagging sense of unease crept in. Could he trust the news outlet to protect his identity? Would they even act on the evidence? Before he could second-guess himself further, he clicked send. For the next 2 days, Lincoln tried to carry on with his routine, but he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. He noticed a black car parked near his apartment, its occupants seemingly paying too much attention to his building. His phone rang frequently, but the calls were from unknown numbers and no messages were left. Late one night, his door was kicked open with a deafening crash. Lincoln barely had time to react before armed officers stormed into his apartment, shouting orders. They forced him to the ground, cuffing his wrists tightly behind his back. One officer sneered at him. "Thought you could play hero," he spat. "We know what you've been up to." Lincoln's heart sank. Someone had leaked his involvement. As he was dragged out of his apartment, he caught a glimpse of his phone being bagged as evidence. He realized with dread that the video was now in their hands, and any chance of exposing the truth seemed to vanish. The media quickly spun the narrative. Lincoln James, a social worker with no criminal history, was being charged with the murder of William Carter. The evidence against him appeared damning. A weapon allegedly found in his apartment and fabricated eyewitness accounts that painted him as a dangerous man. As he sat in a cold interrogation room, awaiting his fate, Lincoln could only hope that anyone, would see through the lies. Lincoln sat silently in the interrogation room, the cold metal chair beneath him amplifying the ache in his wrists from the too tight handcuffs. His mind raced as he replayed the events of the past few days, trying to understand how everything had gone so wrong. The room was suffocatingly sterile, its pale fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows on the walls. Across the table, Detective Clara Mason entered, her presence commanding yet restrained. She carried a folder in her hand, her expression a practiced mask of professionalism. She sat down, opened the folder, and scanned its contents briefly before looking up at Lincoln. "You're in a lot of trouble, Mr. James," she began, her tone clipped. "The evidence against you is overwhelming. A weapon with your fingerprints, eyewitness testimony placing you at the scene of the crime, and—" she tapped the folder for emphasis, "a motive. You knew William Carter, didn't you?" Lincoln met her gaze, his voice steady but tinged with exhaustion. "I didn't kill him. I didn't even know him. All I did was witness something I wasn't supposed to see." Clara raised an eyebrow, feigning curiosity. "Witness what? You've already been caught red-handed. What's the point of lying now?" Lincoln leaned forward, his cuffed hands resting on the table. "I saw 2 cops beating him in a parking lot. I recorded it on my phone. That's why I'm here, because they know I have proof." Clara's expression didn't waver, but something in her eyes flickered. "That's a serious accusation," she said evenly. "Do you have any idea what you're saying?" "I know exactly what I'm saying," Lincoln shot back. "And you know it too. If you dig deep enough, you'll see the evidence was planted. The gun, the witnesses, it's all fake." Clara leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. She'd heard countless denials before, but there was something about Lincoln's composure that gave her pause. He wasn't defensive or panicked like most suspects. He was resolute, almost calm. It unnerved her. "I'll tell you what," she said finally. "I'll look into it, but if you're lying and I waste my time chasing ghosts, it's only going to make things worse for you." Lincoln nodded. "That's all I'm asking. Just look." After the interrogation, Clara returned to her office, her mind buzzing with questions. She pulled up Lincoln's file, combing through his background. Everything about him contradicted the profile of a murderer. No prior arrests, a spotless record, and a career devoted to helping others. It didn't fit. Yet the evidence against him was damning. Over the next few days, Clara quietly reviewed the case. The weapon allegedly found in Lincoln's apartment was curiously devoid of any DNA other than his fingerprints. The timeline of events provided by witnesses was inconsistent. And then there was the issue of the black car Lincoln had mentioned in his testimony. She requested surveillance footage from the area near his apartment, and though it was grainy, she spotted the same vehicle Lincoln had described lingering outside his building on multiple occasions before his arrest. Her unease grew. Clara shared her findings with her partner, Sergeant Grayson, hoping for clarity. "Something about this case feels off," she admitted. "The evidence is too clean, too perfect. It's like it was tailor-made to convict him." Grayson gave her a pointed look, his tone laced with irritation. "You're overthinking this. Lincoln James killed Carter, and now he's trying to manipulate you with conspiracy theories. Don't let him." Clara didn't respond, but doubt gnawed at her. That night, unable to shake her suspicions, she accessed the evidence room. She located Lincoln's phone, which had been cataloged as part of the investigation. She powered it on, but it was locked with a passcode. Frustrated, she returned it to the evidence bag, resolving to push harder for answers the next day. Meanwhile, Lincoln sat alone in his cell, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He knew time was running out. The officers who framed him wouldn't sit idly by while Clara investigated. He could only hope she'd uncover the truth before it was too late. Clara Mason sat in her car outside the station, the engine idling as she stared at the illuminated dashboard. The weight of the Lincoln James case was pressing down on her, each piece of evidence she'd reviewed replaying in her mind. There were cracks, subtle but undeniable. She couldn't ignore them anymore. With a deep breath, she turned off the engine and headed inside, determined to find clarity. At her desk, she spread out the case files, the photos, the reports. The pieces didn't fit together. The weapon found at Lincoln's apartment had only his fingerprints, but no trace of William Carter's blood or DNA. The timeline provided by witnesses was inconsistent, with several of them placing Lincoln at the scene of the murder before he could have reasonably arrived. Clara tapped her pen against the desk, frustration bubbling under her skin. Either Lincoln was an extremely cunning criminal, or someone had orchestrated an elaborate frame-up. Her partner, Sergeant Grayson, noticed her intense focus as he passed by her desk. "You're still obsessing over this?" he asked, his tone tinged with irritation. "It's an open and shut case, Clara. You're wasting your time." Clara didn't look up. "It's too clean," she said, almost to herself. "Every piece of evidence fits too perfectly. It's like someone wanted him to take the fall." Grayson sighed and leaned against the edge of her desk. "You're letting him get into your head. Don't forget who we're dealing with here. A suspect willing to say anything to save his skin." Clara finally met his gaze. "And what if he's telling the truth? What if we're wrong? Do you really want that on your conscience?" Grayson's jaw tightened, and for a brief moment, Clara thought she saw a flicker of something, fear, perhaps, cross his face. But he quickly masked it with a dismissive shrug. "Believe what you want, but don't drag me into your wild theories." As he walked away, Clara felt a knot of unease tighten in her chest. Grayson's response didn't sit right with her. He was usually more supportive, more willing to entertain her instincts. This time, he seemed almost defensive. She pushed the thought aside and returned her focus to the case. Later that evening, Clara revisited the surveillance footage she'd requested from the area near Lincoln's apartment. She froze the video when the black car Lincoln described came into view. The grainy footage didn't reveal much, but the vehicle's repeated presence over several days couldn't be a coincidence. Clara cross-referenced the license plate with the department's database, only to find that it was registered to a shell company with ties to a private security firm known for working with the police. Her stomach churned. Determined to dig deeper, Clara accessed the department's internal records, searching for any connection between the security firm and her colleagues. Her heart sank when she found a contract signed by Sergeant Grayson. The document authorized the firm to assist with sensitive cases. Clara's pulse quickened. Grayson's involvement wasn't just suspicious, it was damning. The next day, Clara visited Lincoln in his cell. She carried the files she'd uncovered along with her own growing doubts. He was seated on the edge of the small cot, his expression weary but resolute. When she entered, he stood, his gaze meeting hers with quiet determination. "You found something," he said, more a statement than a question. Clara hesitated before sliding the files across the table. "I don't know what this proves yet, but you were right about the black car. It's connected to a private firm, one that has ties to the department." Lincoln exhaled, a mix of relief and frustration washing over him. "And Grayson?" Clara's lips pressed into a thin line. "He's involved. I don't know how deep, but he signed off on their involvement in this case." Lincoln nodded slowly. "Then you know what you need to do." Clara felt a pang of conflict. "It's not that simple. If I go after Grayson, I'm putting a target on my back. I need something solid, something that will hold up in court." Lincoln leaned forward, his voice steady. "The recording on my phone. It's the proof you need, but you'll have to unlock it first." Clara's mind raced. She'd seen the phone in the evidence locker, but accessing it without permission would be risky. Still, she knew Lincoln was right. If the recording was as damning as he claimed, it could unravel the entire case. As she left the cell, Clara's thoughts were a whirlwind. She was walking a dangerous line, caught between her duty to the truth and the looming threat of exposing powerful enemies. But one thing was clear. She couldn't turn back now. Clara paced the cold, dimly lit hallway of the police station, the weight of her decision bearing down on her like a leaden anchor. Every step echoed against the walls, a steady rhythm of uncertainty. The evidence locker was just ahead, a nondescript room secured with a keypad and monitored by a single camera. She had reviewed the procedure for accessing evidence countless times in her career, but tonight the stakes were entirely different. Her actions would either expose a system of corruption or ruin her career, and possibly her life. She paused outside the locker, glancing over her shoulder to ensure she was alone. The station was unusually quiet, the usual hum of activity reduced to a faint murmur. With a deep breath, Clara entered the access code and stepped inside. The air smelled faintly of dust and metal, and rows of shelves stretched before her, each labeled with case numbers. It didn't take long to find Lincoln James's phone. The device lay in a sealed evidence bag, its black screen reflecting the faint light overhead. Clara hesitated, her fingers hovering over the bag. Taking the phone was a clear breach of protocol, but she couldn't let that stop her now. Carefully slipping the phone into her pocket, Clara exited the locker and made her way back to her desk. The guilt of her actions gnawed at her, but she pushed it aside. She needed to see what was on that recording. In the privacy of her car, Parked in a shadowy corner of the lot, she powered on the phone. The lock screen greeted her with a passcode prompt, and for a moment, frustration threatened to overwhelm her. She didn't have time for trial and error. Clara drove to a nearby tech store where she knew a discreet technician who could bypass basic security measures. The man didn't ask questions, his only acknowledgement a brief nod as she handed him the device. 40 minutes later, Clara left with the unlocked phone in hand and her nerves frayed to their breaking point. She parked in a secluded lot and opened the video gallery. There it was, the recording Lincoln had described. With a shaky finger, she pressed play. The screen flickered to life, and Clara's heart sank as she watched the scene unfold. 2 officers, one of them unmistakably Sergeant Grayson, stood over William Carter in a dimly lit parking lot. Their voices were low but distinct, dripping with malice. "You've been sticking your nose where it doesn't belong," Grayson said, his tone ice cold. "You think people care about your little exposé?" Carter, bloodied but defiant, spat at Grayson's feet. "The truth always comes out. You can't stop it." Grayson's partner delivered a brutal kick to Carter's side, silencing him momentarily. "Not if you're dead," he sneered. The video ended with Carter's body crumpled on the asphalt, the 2 officers standing over him in grim silence. Clara's hands trembled as she replayed the recording, each detail searing itself into her memory. This was it. This was the proof she needed. But it also meant her partner was a murderer, and she'd been working alongside him for years. The next morning, Clara confronted Grayson in the parking garage of the station. She chose the location carefully, ensuring they would be away from prying eyes. As he stepped out of his car, she approached him, her hand instinctively brushing the grip of her service weapon. "We need to talk," she said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. Grayson smirked, his usual confidence oozing from every movement. "What's this about, Mason? You finally ready to drop this nonsense about James?" Clara held up her phone, the screen displaying the first frame of the video. "I know what you did, Grayson. I saw the video. It's over." The smirk vanished from his face, replaced by a cold, calculating glare. "You shouldn't have done that," he said, his voice low and menacing. "You have no idea what you've just gotten yourself into." Clara didn't flinch. "You think you can intimidate me? This isn't just about you, Grayson. This goes higher, doesn't it? The private firm, the planted evidence. How deep does it go?" Grayson stepped closer, his posture threatening. "Walk away, Mason. Forget about this, and you might keep your badge and your life." Clara stood her ground. "No, I'm taking this to internal affairs, and I'm handing the video to an independent investigator. You can't stop this." Grayson's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Clara thought he might attack her. But instead, he turned and walked away, muttering under his breath. "You just signed your death warrant." Shaken but resolute, Clara returned to her car. She knew Grayson wasn't bluffing, but she also knew she couldn't back down now. The truth was out there, and it was her responsibility to ensure it came to light. The next step was clear. She had to act quickly before Grayson or his allies could retaliate. Her fight was only just beginning. Clara didn't waste any time. She drove straight to her apartment, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly, her mind racing with what she needed to do next. The recording on Lincoln's phone was the smoking gun, but she knew better than to trust the department to handle it. There were too many people like Grayson, officers, who were either complicit or too scared to act. Clara had to think ahead, anticipate every move her enemies might make. Once inside her apartment, she locked the door and pulled all the blinds shut. She sat at her kitchen table, phone in hand, and began transferring the video to an encrypted cloud account. If anything happened to her, the evidence would still exist. She also emailed the video to a trusted friend, a journalist who had a reputation for exposing police corruption. The email was short and to the point. "This is the truth about William Carter's death. Publish it if something happens to me." Her phone buzzed with an incoming call. The number was blocked. She hesitated before answering, her instincts screaming danger. "Mason," she said cautiously, "you're playing a dangerous game," a distorted voice said. "Walk away now, or you won't live to see tomorrow." The line went dead before she could respond. Clara's pulse quickened, but she forced herself to remain calm. She had expected this. It was confirmation that she was on the right track, but it also meant she needed to move fast. The next morning, Clara arrived at the station early, before most of her colleagues. She went straight to internal affairs, her expression calm, but her heart pounding. The head of the department, Lieutenant Sarah Connors, looked up as Clara entered. "This better be good, Mason," Connors said, motioning for her to sit. Clara placed Lincoln's phone and a USB drive containing the video on the desk. "This is evidence that Sergeant Grayson and another officer murdered William Carter. They framed Lincoln James to cover it up." Connors raised an eyebrow, her skepticism clear. "That's a bold accusation. Do you have anything to back it up?" "Watch the video," Clara said firmly. Connors inserted the USB drive into her computer. As the video played, her expression shifted from mild disbelief to outright shock. When it ended, she leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly. "This is damning," Connors admitted, "but it's also dangerous. If this gets out, it'll blow a hole in the department." "That's the point," Clara said. "We can't keep looking the other way. This corruption has to be rooted out." Connors nodded reluctantly. "I'll start the process, but this won't be easy. Grayson has friends in high places. They won't let this go without a fight." As Clara left internal affairs, she felt a glimmer of hope for the first time in weeks. But her relief was short-lived. When she returned to her desk, Grayson was waiting for her, his expression cold and calculating. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low. Clara glanced around. The station was beginning to fill with officers, but she knew better than to assume she was safe. She followed Grayson to a secluded corner of the parking garage, keeping her hand near her weapon. The tension between them was palpable. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life," Grayson said, his tone venomous. "Do you really think Connors will protect you? She's just as dirty as the rest of them." Clara didn't flinch. "The video is already out. Even if something happens to me, the truth will come out." Grayson's jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he might attack her. But instead, he stepped back, his smile cold and menacing. "You think this is over? It's just beginning." As he walked away, Clara felt a chill run down her spine. She knew Grayson wouldn't back down, but she also knew she couldn't stop now. The video was in the hands of internal affairs and the media. All she could do was hope it was enough. That evening, Clara received a call from her journalist friend. "The video is going live tonight," he said. "Brace yourself. It's going to get messy." True to his word, the video was published on every major news outlet within hours. The footage sparked outrage, with protests erupting across the city. Grayson and his partner were immediately placed on administrative leave, pending an investigation. But Clara knew this was just the beginning. The corruption ran deeper than two officers, and the fight for justice would be long and grueling. Back in his cell, Lincoln watched the news on a small television. For the first time since his arrest, he felt a spark of hope. Clara had kept her word, and the truth was finally out. But he knew the battle wasn't over. He just hoped he would live to see the day when justice was fully served. The city erupted in chaos as news of the video spread like wildfire. Crowds gathered outside the police station, holding signs and chanting for justice. The footage of Sergeant Grayson and his partner brutalizing William Carter was impossible to ignore. News outlets dissected every second of the recording, and public outrage reached a boiling point. Inside his cell, Lincoln James watched the coverage on the small communal television, his expression a mixture of relief and apprehension. The truth was finally out, but he knew this was only the beginning. While Clara Mason sat in her apartment, the curtains drawn and her phone buzzing incessantly with calls and messages. Some were from colleagues, both supportive and accusatory, while others were threats from anonymous numbers. She ignored most of them, her focus on the email she had just received from Lieutenant Connors. It was a formal notice. Grayson and his partner had been arrested, and an independent investigation into their actions was underway. But Connors had also included a warning. The department was under immense pressure, and Clara's position was now in jeopardy. That evening, Clara returned to the station to find the atmosphere thick with tension. Officers whispered in corners, some glaring at her as she passed. She could feel the weight of their judgment but refused to be intimidated. She made her way to the holding cells, determined to see Lincoln. When she reached his cell, Lincoln stood and approached the bars, his face lighting up with cautious optimism. "I saw the news," he said. "You did it. You got the truth out there." Clara nodded, her expression serious. "It's not over yet. The department is in damage control mode, and they'll do everything they can to protect their image. But the investigation is moving forward. Grayson and his partner won't get away with this." Lincoln studied her for a moment, sensing her unease. "And what about you? They're not going to let you walk away from this unscathed." "I'm not worried about that," she said, though her voice betrayed her. "This isn't about me. It's about making sure people like you don't get silenced." Before she could say more, an officer approached, his face grim. "Mason, Lieutenant Connors wants to see you. Now." Clara exchanged a glance with Lincoln, her gut tightening. "I'll be back," she said before following the officer. Connors was waiting in her office, her expression unreadable. She gestured for Clara to sit, but Clara remained standing. "What's this about?" Clara asked, her tone wary. Connors sighed and folded her hands on the desk. "You've stirred up a hornet's nest, Mason. The brass isn't happy, and they're looking for someone to blame. They want me to suspend you while the investigation plays out." Clara clenched her fists, her anger bubbling to the surface. "Suspend me? For what? For exposing the truth?" Connors leaned forward, her voice low. "You and I both know this department doesn't reward whistleblowers. They want to make an example of you, to discourage anyone else from stepping out of line." Clara's mind raced. She had anticipated backlash, but the reality of it hit harder than she expected. "So that's it? They're just going to throw me under the bus?" Connors hesitated before speaking. "I don't agree with it, but my hands are tied. For what it's worth, you did the right thing. But you need to think about your next move carefully." Later that night, Clara sat in her apartment, the weight of the day pressing down on her. She had spent her entire career believing in the justice system, and now she was being punished for doing the right thing. Her phone buzzed, and she saw a message from the journalist she had worked with. It was simple. The story is spreading. People are waking up. You did good. The message gave her a small sense of solace. The fight wasn't over, but she had made a difference. A week later, Lincoln James stood outside the courthouse, a free man. The charges against him had been dropped, and the case against Grayson and his partner was gaining momentum. The press swarmed around him, but Lincoln focused on the faces of the people who had gathered to support him. Among them was Clara, standing quietly at the edge of the crowd. As their eyes met, Lincoln walked over and extended his hand. "Thank you," he said simply. "You saved my life." Clara shook his hand, a small smile tugging at her lips. "You saved yourself." "I just did what I should have done." They stood in silence for a moment, watching as the crowd chanted for justice. Clara knew her career in the department was over, but she didn't regret her decision. She had uncovered the truth, and that was worth more than any badge. As Lincoln stepped forward to address the crowd, Clara slipped away, her heart heavy, but her conscience clear. The fight for justice was far from over, but she knew she had done her part. The truth was out, and for now, that was enough. What would you have done in their place? The story may end here, but the questions remain. Share your thoughts in the comments and let us know how you feel about this journey. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next grippin' story.